It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman. You feeling trusty today, David?
Yes, I trust.
You trust, and the trustiest...
I trust that people will violate that trust.
And we also have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
We have a great show, as always. Every day, 1,500 people die unnecessarily due to COVID-19. In Bob Woodward's latest book, Rage, we learned that Donald Trump knew how dangerous and easily transmissible this virus was, yet he lied to the American people and downplayed it. What is it in the psychology of Donald Trump that makes him incapable of dealing with this crisis? Our first guest, Dr. Bandy Lee, a psychiatrist from Yale School of Medicine, has been on the show before to talk about President Trump's pathology. Today, she'll update us on that and also tell us a little about her recent interview with Mary Trump, Donald Trump's niece. Mary Trump just released her own book, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, which eerily echoes the title of the book Dr. Lee edited 2.5 years ago when we talked about it in this program, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Mary Trump is also a psychiatrist, and in her book, she shines a light on her uncle's toxic upbringing. And that's just the first part of the show. In the second part, we're going to talk to Tarek Milliran, who is one of the many discerning consumers in the Nader family tree. In fact, he is Ralph's nephew, and like Ralph, he is not fond of Amazon, a corporation many of us don't like, but sometimes feel at a loss to avoid. Well, today he's going to give us some great tips on how not to give Jeff Bezos more of your hard-earned money. In between, we will, as always, take some time to check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's talk about Donald Trump's mental pathology. David?
Dr. Bandy Lee is a forensic psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine and an internationally recognized expert on violence. Dr. Lee is the president of the World Mental Health Coalition and has worked with various governments to implement violence prevention programs in prisons and the community. She edited the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. Dr. Lee launched her own website, bandylee.com, which now features an interview with Dr. Mary Trump. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dr. Bandy Lee.
Thank you for having me back.
Welcome indeed, Bandy. When you started issuing the warnings about Trump's instability and dysfunction and ego obsession right after he was selected by the Electoral College, people thought, whoa, this is really something. This is way out. Are you sure? Well, you've been proven right again and again, day after day after day. In no era of Trump's regime have you been proven more right than during the COVID-19 pandemic period, where you say, quote, Trump is directly responsible for the death of thousands of Americans, which could have been avoided if he had just taken responsibility, end quote, instead of denying it, lying about it, scoffing about it in those key days in January and February. But in March, your organization came out with what you called a prescription for survival in a Trumpian age. Could you inform our listeners about how dramatically grounded that prescription is?
Yes, thank you. Well, we felt that what has now become obvious of his calamitous mishandling of the pandemic was essentially pretty much an inevitable outcome of his psychology. And so a couple weeks into his announcing the pandemic, and when he was doing daily briefings, we felt that the nation was in grave danger. And so we put out our prescription for survival, my organization and I, as well as allied health professionals. We ourselves are thousands of mental health professionals, but others have joined us to put out a prescription for survival where we outline that the president's mental disturbances are just too great for him to ever manage the pandemic properly. And therefore, for the sake of our survival, for the nation's ability to save many lives, and it turns out to be hundreds of thousands of lives so far, we put out a prescription, and it was that from a medical perspective, it did not matter what means were used to remove the dangers, whether it be impeachment, the 25th Amendment, demand for resignation, or removal from influence of the public from decision making, as well as the press conferences that he insisted on daily. That to us was imperative, that the dangers be removed. And so we listed the options for lawmakers and the public. And so that was our prescription, which was written on March 25th.
And the most current prescription, basically, you want Trump and Pence to step aside from mismanaging the federal government's response to the pandemic crisis and have professional pandemic scientists and managers shape the federal response, coordination with the state, local, and putting forth the soundest scientific approach and advice instead of telling people they can drink bleach or take drugs that aren't effective and have dangerous side effects that Trump has been engaging in, and he keeps doubling down. He never retracts, never admits mistakes as part of the profile that you've shaped. When someone never admits mistakes, never regrets any decision, never apologizes, says he's doing things perfect, gives himself a 10 rating in managing the pandemic when he was asked by a reporter. How do you analyze that in psychological terms?
Yes, and he does that to this day. It is quite severe. And thank you for reading out part of our prescription refill. When our prescription was not heeded, we put out a refill just a couple weeks ago. And that was basically to turn everything over to scientists, because the president's psychology and mental impairments will not allow him to change course and to correct it, even after hundreds of thousands of deaths being proven, and even after his lies and misrepresentation have been revealed. And that is exactly what you pointed out, his inability to take responsibility for his own actions and the inability to admit that he was wrong. So even recently, I believe last night at the town hall, he continued to insist that millions of lives were saved because of his actions and that he did not do anything wrong. So these were the dangers that we had been warning against since the very beginning of the presidency. We did not know there would be a pandemic, but we knew that were there to be a crisis, this would be the result, that he simply would not be able to manage it. And we actually did a full evaluation of his mental capacity when the Mueller report came out. It was the perfect kind of information in abundance under sworn testimony by close associates and coworkers to be able to assess his decision-making capacity, and he failed every criterion. And so it's truly an incredibly dangerous and troubling situation that he remains in office.
Well, it's not too late to have a national movement demanding that Trump step aside and let professional pandemic scientists and managers take the helm, because there are a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill that want that, because they want him to concentrate on the campaign and not engage in daily bungling, which reduces their own polls in their reelection fight. Yeah.
Yeah, it should begin today, as you mentioned, with the upwards of 1,500 deaths per day. Every day counts, and especially with a pandemic which spirals out of control. In fact, the infections accelerate because that's just the nature of pandemics, and it becomes harder and harder to contain. And so the sooner we do it, the more lives we can save.
Well, there are a lot of people who would band together here. I think leading citizen groups can be persuaded, Public Citizen, Common Cause, People for the American Way, the American Public Health Association, a lot of medical associations. You're coming forward together with some of the top mental health professionals in the country, if not in the world, in your efforts over the last 3 years or so.
Yes, we have quite a few renowned mental health experts among us who have agreed with us since the start, and they continue to try to warn the public. I feel that with the efforts of many of the very noble efforts of health associations and so forth, we truly do need to address the source of all this difficulty, which is the president's mental state. And that is the reason why we have such difficulty mobilizing lawmakers, mobilizing the public, because he continues to maneuver the public psychologically in a way where those who are intending well are exhausted and those who are vulnerable actually sign on to his ever new changing narrative, whereby he disconnects them from reality.
Also, he politicizes and takes control of the Centers for Disease Prevention. The Food and Drug Administration forces them to suppress scientifically based advice and come up with political advice driven by his assistants in the White House. Why do you think the citizen movement in this country has not coalesced behind you for a step-aside demand? Because he's dangerously advising people every day. And, there are people all over the country say, well, I don't need a mask. The president doesn't need a mask. And now he's starting in-person rallies, which are devastating. There's no social distance, quite apart from the people there who come to hear him. And someone asked him, do you think it's perilous, Mr. President? And he said, well, I'm far from the crowd. I'm on the stage. He interpreted it as if the question was addressed to him and not to the several thousand people in the audience crammed together.
Well, that alone is very telling, isn't it? That he believes that if he is safe, that everyone else is safe, or that everyone else doesn't really matter. And there are many complex psychological processes behind this. But
back to why the citizen movements, the citizen groups all over the country are not organizing together.
I think there was a time when we were able to get a lot of public attention and media attention 2.5 years ago when we raised this issue to the number one topic of national conversation. I believe the public actually responded in a very enlightened way. And then the American Psychiatric Association stepped in, essentially acting as an arm of the government, and shut us down. People have described this as a switch, that they thought that this conversation was going to keep going, and then it suddenly shut down and they didn't hear from us again. And despite our efforts since then, we just haven't been able to gain the traction. And the media organizations somehow, whether they were convinced by the APA, even though their new guideline, I might add, since the Trump administration, that we're not supposed to mention anything, any comment about any objective observation of the president. That applies only to their members, and that's only 6% of mental health professionals. But the media somehow took that to mean that none of them were supposed to. And so that kind of misinformation and public campaigns have shut us down. But as you can see, the issue isn't going away. The issue is becoming to the point of being an utter disastrous emergency.
Well, what your group has is the courage to come to the conclusions from your analysis. And too many citizen groups, too many columnists, too many editorial writers, they share your analysis of the disastrous response and non-response by the Trump administration to the pandemic, but they don't come to the conclusions of their own analysis the way you do. So you have to address them. It's not that they disagree with you at all. They even fulminate with even greater rigor. I mean, George Will, a conservative columnist, called the Trump government a gangster regime.
They're coming around to our position, of course, 3 years later, but it's the same in terms of not having experts. And that is a very dangerous situation for our country in terms of both the pandemic and the mental health issue, the exclusion of experts in any dialogue. And of course, their assessments will be underestimating and normalizing the presidency, no matter how hard they try, because they just, that's the benefit of expertise. And the benefit also of being an expert is that you can speak about the projected consequences as well as interventions that we do on a daily basis of similar personalities, similar situations, albeit in smaller scale. But this occurs all the time. I alone have seen about 1,000 individuals with Mr. Trump's presentation. And so it is not new to me, whereas to the general public, it is very new and surprising for most.
Well, how can people reach you and your group?
Well, they can reach out to me through the website you mentioned, bandylee.com. They can look up our prescription through prescriptionforsurvival.org, and they will also get to our website where plenty of material is available and they can contact us, and we're always ready to consult. In fact, always have been overly eager and even desperately eager. So,
and your website again?
World Mental Health Coalition, which is worldmhc.org, or they can go to dangerouscase.org. It'll redirect them directly to our website.
Any comments from Steve and David?
Oh, yeah. I don't think we can leave you, Dr. Lee, without talking about your conversation with Mary Trump, who is the president's niece, who's also a psychiatrist, who came out with the book that we mentioned at the top of the show. Did Mary Trump tell you anything you didn't already know? What insight did you get from her, if any?
Well, just like any revelations that come from either the White House or the president's colleagues or his niece, they're details that simply confirm our analysis of his psychological makeup and structure, which we already had abundant information about, decades of high quality data and sworn testimonies. It was very hard to beat that, but I truly appreciated her perspective from an intimate family member, being part of the family, and her ability to rise above her personal experiences to apply her professional training and objective observations as a clinical psychologist, and to do that from an intimate setting and come to the exact same conclusions as we did as a group of psychiatrists and other mental health experts who came at it from a public health perspective. So in a sense, she completed our loop. She confirmed many of our analyses as well as brought from a different direction the same consensus that we have all had. And so it was very valuable in that way, and I respect her greatly as an expert.
Yes, she sort of gave a heritage aspect of the family dynamic that we wouldn't necessarily be privy to, correct?
Yes. So it's very valuable, in-depth information, and we as mental health professionals often use ourselves as instruments of observation. So her own experiences, as she was able to detach herself with training in her adulthood, she said, that becomes extremely valuable confirmation of the assessment that we had already made, but not with that type of information.
You can read the interview with Mary Trump by Dr. Bandy Lee on your website, no?
That's right. Yes, it's featured on my website, bandylee.com. It still remains the only interview of her by a fellow mental health professional, and many people have valued it for that because we're able to go further in depth about her observations and the soundness of her evaluation.
One comment stood out, Dr. Lee, by Mary Trump, and she was talking about the stresses on Donald J. Trump, and here's her words. Quote, "The stresses are unimaginable. Imagine the energy it takes him when he is supposed to be the best and winning everything all the time. The danger inherent in being faced with his inadequacies is astronomical," end quote. That is a really key insight.
Yes, it truly describes the urgency he would feel to salvage his own psychic survival, if you will. He would go to any length to do that. And that's why this season of elections and his power being at stake is such a dangerous time.
Dr. Bandy Lee, we're just getting word that Michael Caputo, he's the former Trump spokesman for HHS,
Hmm.
he seems to have had what I saw on Facebook was a breakdown, and he's taking a 60-day medical leave. He went on Facebook and said CDC officials are plotting against Trump and people should take arms against people who don't vote for Trump. Is the problem that anybody who works for Trump is either catching the mental illness or comes to him already mentally ill? Is mental illness contagious? And or do
Uh,
people who are already mentally ill gravitate to this man?
yes, it's all those things. I do emphasize the contagion part because we often don't think of it. We don't think of mental symptoms as being contagious, but in fact, they could be more contagious in certain instances than infectious diseases like the coronavirus. It is because you don't require physical contact. You only need emotional bonds and continued exposure. And we somewhat have made a setup of the president's symptoms to be spread in the population. When you have a severely mentally impaired person who goes untreated and is in an influential position with continual exposure to the public, then this is what you would get. I've seen it numerous times in prison settings or with the state hospital population where individuals go untreated. But we now have a situation where the president has not been treated by virtue of his position of power and influence, and that is a somewhat perfect storm for contagion of symptoms. The good news about that is that when he's removed from influence, a lot of this will abate. I'm not talking about those with similar symptoms being gravitated toward him, although those get confirmed and exacerbated, but those who are previously healthy will be able to come back to their general reasoning. In fact, there was a dip in his polls since earlier on in the pandemic when he was not able to hold rallies, he wasn't holding press conferences, and his approval rating went down. Many people thought it was finally people recognizing his mishandling of the pandemic that was causing that, but I had a different hypothesis that it was really the diminution of his exposure to the public. And we see again that even though more people have died since, that his poll numbers are going up again as he is doing his rallies. And even though he is bringing them into spaces that will cause greater deaths among them, in fact, when it's this huge crowd, he's killing a certain number with each rally. And yet it doesn't seem to influence his approval numbers or the crowds that are gathering.
By the way, Dr. Lee, I just want to ask you, China is where the pandemic virus emanated from, and they claim that they brought it under control with slightly less than 5,000 deaths, and the United States is now zooming toward 200,000 deaths, and China has 4 times the population. Do you agree with that estimate, and how did China pull something like this off?
Well, there was a great deal of marvel and praise earlier on that the Chinese government was using very draconian measures to contain the virus, which turns out were necessary because of the contagiousness and the lethality of the virus. But of course, the Chinese government initially tried to cover up and tried to stifle a whistleblower, and he ended up dying from the disease. But they turned it around and saw that their image, world image, and ability to continue their reign would depend on their controlling this virus. And so, whereas I believe that 5,000 deaths is probably not even close to reality, they have done much better than we have. And that just goes back to the severity of detachment from reality that Mr. Trump brings, and just the level of danger that we're in, because this could very well spiral out of control. And since February and March, I have been saying that the death toll will match his mental state, his mental inabilities, and this is exactly what is happening at the moment, and that is pretty bottomless, because he's not going to fight the virus, he is going to fight reality instead.
You're at the Yale School of Medicine?
Yes.
You're at the Yale University School of Medicine. Do your colleagues in their various specialties share your concerns?
Many do, but you may note that since the publication of the book, it was more of my Harvard colleagues who came forth rather than my Yale colleagues. I've been rather disappointed with Yale at its inability to come forth with its own decisions rather than just towing the line of the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, which I think was very misguided and unfortunately split the psychiatric community. Not along the lines of assessing Donald Trump. We've had a consensus there from the start, but along the lines of whether or not we should speak about it. It's very clear that speaking up would have saved lives, and we have a primary responsibility to society. We do not have a primary responsibility to a public figure, and yet the APA ended up protecting a public figure at the expense of public health, in my view.
On that professional note, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Bandy Lee, and we look forward to future efforts by you and your profession to give real meaning to the term professional courage.
Well, thank you. We won't stop until the dangers are removed, that's for sure.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Yale psychiatrist Dr. Bandy Lee. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to talk about alternatives to shopping at Amazon. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 2, 2020. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Ever since Volkswagen was caught 5 years ago using illegal software to conceal the fact that its clean diesel cars were polluting the air, the company has insisted that the wrongdoing was the work of lower-level employees. Managers at the top were clueless, Volkswagen claimed. This week, prosecutors in Munich will challenge that assertion in court for the first time. They will begin presenting evidence in the trial of Rupert Stadler, a former chief executive of Volkswagen's Audi luxury car division. That's according to a report in the New York Times. The trial is the first in Germany stemming from the scandal, but the case will also test whether prosecutors can overcome the difficulties inherent in trying to convict top managers protected by layers of bureaucracy. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman. We're giving Ralph this segment off. You'll find out why. But first, I want to tell you that Jeff Bezos is now the first person in the world to be worth $200 billion, with a B, $billion. And Oxfam estimates that he could give all 876,000 Amazon employees a one-time $105,000 bonus and still have more money than he did before the pandemic. There are countless reasons why you may not want to support Amazon. Our next guest doesn't want to either. David?
$200 billion? He's worth
Yep.
$200 billion?
Yeah.
You know what the saddest part about this is?
What?
Imagine how much more he'd be worth if he could have kept his marriage together.
Yes, it would have been $400 billion.
Wow.
Roughly estimating.
Yeah. Tarek Milleran learned at the feet of the master how to be an intelligent consumer. And like his uncle Ralph Nader, he has some very strong feelings about Amazon. He avoids using Amazon. We've invited him on to give all of us some tips on how to avoid Amazon. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Tarek Milleran.
Thank you, David. Hi, Steve.
Hi,
Good to be
Tarek.
here.
Nice to have you on. So first tell us, I mean, I guess it shouldn't surprise us, you know, as part of the Nader family tree, that you would be a discerning consumer. But first tell us how you kind of came to this. And I assumed you'd used Amazon in the beginning before. So what was the transition there? And what's the reasoning behind this? Why do you want to avoid Amazon?
Yeah, I still use Amazon, but less and less and less, and I'll be canceling my Prime membership when it comes due. And it's not a philosophical reason. I actually think that people are just bamboozled into using Amazon and also use it just out of laziness. They don't want to put their credit card information in many times on other websites. And I've just concluded they waste my time too often and money. So,
How do they do that? How does Amazon waste your time?
So, they basically, you get used to using it. And of course, you get used to using it for things you need at the very last minute. And several times it's just completely let me down and left me really fairly infuriated by leading me down the garden path and then failing to deliver. So I can give you an example. I needed some specialty photo paper made by Canon, and the photographer I was working with sent me the link, and of course the link took me straight to Amazon, and I needed the paper right away for a big project we were doing. And, Amazon kind of leads me down this path of choosing this and choosing that. But then I'm trying to figure out, will it really arrive in time? And no, it won't really arrive in time. And the window's too big. And, you just feel fooled. In this case, I just went to Canon's website, bought the paper directly from them. Yeah, I paid a little bit more, but in the end, they actually had a big discount on it. And I got the paper when I needed it, which is a couple of days later.
Wow. And so now you've explored other ways to avoid Amazon. Give us more examples. What can people do if you were going to give somebody some tips and coach them on how to avoid it?
Well, this is such a bizarre year that, in our household, we use Walmart online and we feel like we're being progressive, which is absurd.
Yeah.
Like we're pushing back against the man. We're using Walmart.
Wow.
So
you have to find the next biggest man to push against the big man, I guess.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so what I tend to do now is I just take the extra few minutes to put in my credit card information to use businesses online that never waste my time. And, it's very
And your
unlike
website, some websites will store your credit card information. So is that safe?
Well, yeah, that's above my pay grade, but I don't save credit card information. I just tend to put it in because really, when I say people are being fooled, literally it's just a few seconds. Like you're going to miss the next cat video someone sent you, like via text or something. It just take the time and then do an honest accounting. Like how often does Amazon really work out for you the way you think it should, or the way it's represented? And how often you buy crap on Amazon that breaks and you don't return? So just doing an honest accounting, I think, gets you a long way. But I have another example of a product where Amazon really blew my stack. And that is in around 1980, this coach in Ohio named Dick Hartzell, he invented these rubber bands that you use for exercise. And that was an innovation back then. Well, I was going traveling and I needed some of these bands. And the coach started a company called Jump Stretch, but his product, I believe, was called Flex Band. Well, if you search for Jump Stretch, of course, now it takes you straight to Amazon, where there are a bunch of knockoffs that have taken his company name and applied it to a, exactly similar looking product. So about 3 years ago, I went searching around. I remembered the word Jump Stretch. Boom, I end up at Amazon. I buy the stuff. Now, I have no idea where the original bands are made or anything, but I know the ones that I bought, one of them, the color came off and got all over my stuff. And, it was like a nightmare. Well, what am I going to do? I think I paid $20 for that. So I ended up just tossing those and just never using them. But now you can just go straight to the source. You just go, you look up Dick Hartzell Jump Stretch, and you'll find the real product. If you really want it, buy it from the original source.
What about prices, though? Isn't that one of the, isn't going through Amazon cheaper?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it's cheaper, but for me, factoring in the aggravation and just wanting to have a better experience, that makes the difference for me. Saving a little bit of money doesn't really add up. But I use Abe Books. Abe Books is owned by Amazon, and that has generally worked really, really well for me. Of course, they just picked up someone else's nice project, right? Which is sort of their MO.
Right. Well, and I think that's probably Ralph's big problem is the monopoly issue, because his issues, I mean, we all know that Ralph, and I know who'll be listening to this, is a bit of a Luddite. I've talked to him about that. He still types on a manual typewriter. And so he's not as, the fact that you're putting in your credit card information to anybody would be anathema to him, because he doesn't participate in the credit economy.
You
But
kind of skated, excuse me for 1 second, you kind of
yeah,
skated over the issue of money. Is Amazon, in fact, cheaper? And isn't that what most consumers are looking for, a bargain?
Yeah, I mean that's what's dangled in front of you over and over. But you can beat them on price, but you can definitely beat them on service. I mean, another example. I needed to buy some refill for a pen that my wife had, and I went on Amazon and I went through all the steps. You see, so they were using your time there, and put it in my cart. And no, lo and behold, I didn't meet the limit for it actually to be delivered, but we'll wait until you add more items. Well, it just makes smoke come out of my ears. I walked out of my local stationery store and bought the pen and, felt great. So, I think it's sort of a myth that they beat mom and pop. Because if you think about it, organized mom and pop could beat Amazon on every common item. In other words, if there were a structure where they could show their inventory collectively,
yeah,
they would beat it.
or provide services that Amazon can't provide. In the case of a bookstore, you have guest speakers, you have other things going on that are part of the community, the local community, that a behemoth like Amazon can't replicate. I guess there's got to be some creative thinking along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think. But I also tend to go to specialty stores online like B&H Photo or McMaster Car. Those are two fabulous websites where you have people who really know their business very well, and you don't need to rely on 4,800 reviews of the child seat you're going to buy or whatever.
Right.
You're dealing with experts, so
Right.
you're paying a bit more for it, and it's worth it. I really think ultimately people are just fooling themselves.
Well, there's also an issue, and I think the pandemic, at least in our household, has brought this forth, is the idea of packaging too. And we avoid Amazon as much as possible. And my wife does most of we're now buying air purifiers because of what's going on with the wildfires here, and going straight to the sources. Most of it, we managed to get one under the wire because they're getting sold out. But we also get a lot of food delivered. We haven't been in a store for about 6 months, and the packaging is starting to pile up. And that's not just Amazon. I guess it's all delivery services, but we kind of get addicted to this, and there's this externality that happens where all of this cardboard is being used, and what do you do with it?
Sure, cardboard and plastic bubbles and so forth. Even though packaging is better designed now than maybe 10 years ago, yeah, it really adds up. But I think the thing with Amazon, as opposed to focusing on what you really need and going to the right place to buy it, is that you got this steady stream of little packages that come to your house. It's almost like an addiction, or you think of the thing you need. It just basically softens your brain to have these. That's sort of my philosophy.
Well, every day's Christmas.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So you get a little reward, and then you continue to reward yourself.
That does make sense.
It is an American pastime. Shopping is an American pastime, but it used to be in person, and now it's kind of in the ether.
David, do you avoid Amazon? Are you able to do that, or how do you operate?
I mean, I live a very ascetic lifestyle where, I don't want to get too personal, but I ask myself, do I want this? And then I wait a day or two, and then after a day or two, then I buy it if I really, really need it.
Want
as opposed, yeah, and so I end up buying very few things. And the older I get, knowing some people with hoarding problems. And I think that shopping on Amazon is tantamount to a gambling problem. I think for a lot of people, it satisfies the same part of the brain. It's like a slot machine. So it lights up. They figured out how to light up your brain when you buy something on Amazon.
Right.
I don't buy anything unless it's absolutely necessary, because you
No,
don't
I
need
think that's
anything, right,
right.
Tarek? I mean, you live in Northern California, and there's a tradition up there of learning not to buy anything. You don't need anything.
Yeah, well, I would think of myself as sort of not a materialist until I look at all the tools I own, for example, or for work that I do for my nonprofit. You know, I end up buying a lot of recording equipment and whatnot. And so,
But that's stuff you need. But in
it,
terms
it,
of
it, it,
clothes or processed food, all that stuff is literally garbage. It becomes garbage. It starts off as garbage.
yeah, and I agree. I mean, it certainly is an addictive thing, and maybe more people should start pranking Amazon by filling their cart and then emptying it a few
I was
days
going to
later.
ask you about that. Culture jamming.
Yeah, yeah, just hang it out there. Of course, they've probably figured out some way of tapping your card in the interim or some weird thing they figured out. But yeah, I
Well,
think it's a menace. I mean, it's just less of a motivator to me because the fact is, let's say you really do need something, just don't go to Amazon. Figure out truly the best source for it. Save money by not buying as much.
but it's what makes that difficult is that you do put something in your search engine and it funnels you right there, and it's the first three choices. Especially
Oh,
for
well, that's
books.
my favorite tip for searches is just minus Amazon. I
Oh
just
well,
exclude Amazon from my searches.
so how? Wait a minute. Sounds like a very practical tip. What do? You write in minus Amazon, or how?
Yeah, minus Amazon.com. And you can get rid of Amazon except for the promoted sites. But yeah, when it dominates, it totally dominates. Like you get Amazon UK and stuff coming at you when you're in
Yeah.
California and they know where you are and all that. Yeah, it's really irritating. So I just get rid of it.
And so you can literally write air purifier minus Amazon.com.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. There's a very practical tip. I had no idea you could actually do that and that would work. And David,
Yeah, I'm sure that.
I was going to say a lot of podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. David has his own podcast in addition to this program called The David Feldman Show. We'll give you a plug there.
Now comes the hit.
Well, I want to know a lot
Yep.
of podcasts. Amazon is, if you go through that, say the David Feldman Show website, Amazon gives you a little taste, right? Are you still doing that?
I am. Yes, I am.
You
yes.
realize you're under oath, sir.
Thanks for the plug. Thanks for plugging my podcast there, friend. Yes, guilty as charged. I say, but here's the thing. I do say that if you have to shop on Amazon, do it through what is called an affiliate link, because they don't charge you more and you're making Amazon about 5 to 7% less evil.
All
But
right, so,
I would like to stop using Amazon, but people do shop on Amazon. So
but that must be enough of a payoff to make it worth it for you, right?
not a lot, but enough for me to say this is a hard habit to shake.
Right.
So yeah, no, it's not good. I'm not happy about it.
Well, then there's let me ask you guys, we use Amazon Prime, and likewise, it just really irritates me. You end up having to pay for everything. The content that's free is by and large terrible, or you've watched it years ago or whatever.
Right.
What do you do for the content on the content side of things? Do you use Amazon?
Have you heard of books?
Well, I have to say I got a Kindle about 5 years ago, and it's very addictive. Well, I wouldn't say addictive. It's actually very practical here because I just press a thing and I get the book, and it usually is cheaper. And I don't have a stack of books in my house that I got to find more shelving for. So there is something, that is very attractive about that.
And movies and stuff like that.
Movies, it's, now I guess, we subscribe to Netflix and Hulu, and I guess we do have Amazon Prime, but you're right. We're still paying money to rent the movies that aren't terrible or aren't, so outdated, I guess. And it's a hard thing. It's an octopus that's hard to kind of extricate yourself from.
Yeah, you can't really easily cut it out of your life as a reality because of their cloud services and all that. And so I don't even look at it that way, really. It's just buy where it's more efficient, buy from businesses that don't piss you off.
Well, there you have it. That's Tarek Milliron's How to Survive Amazon.
So I was raised by Ralph Nader. I mean, my mother would watch, I guess, your grandmother on Phil Donahue.
Right.
We voted. Ralph would send us a ballot on how to vote, and my mother took her cues from your grandmother from the Phil Donahue show. Sugar was banned, and consumerism. I was raised in an era of consumerism where don't buy things unless they're absolutely necessary. Without getting too personal, I'm kind of surprised to hear that I know that you don't use Amazon, but like asking questions about disposable junk like movies, and I'm surprised you even bother with that garbage.
Well, what can I say? I'm a Californian who watches movies and comedy shows.
Even though it's bad for your health. It's like sugar. I mean, it really is as bad for you as sugar.
Well, I don't know. That's a little extreme. I mean, it's the way the world is set up, and unless you want to, cut yourself off from that, I know you and me as comedians, we have to sort of be a little cognizant of what's going on in pop culture. And that's
I'm sorry,
that's where you find it.
What is cognizant?
Cognizant means knowing. I've got the best words.
Anytime you can make yourself or your loved ones laugh by kind of whatever means necessary, it just has to happen. So sometimes it happens through mass-produced entertainment. And
we were talking before we went on the air that, some of us have kids in the house, not me, not David, but Tarek, you've got kids in the house and you're all stuck inside, and there's got to be ways to entertain each other and entertain them and be able to get some space from each other. And,
I wasn't allowed growing up. I wasn't allowed to watch TV. It was very limited. Very
really
limited. Yeah.
I wouldn't say I was a TV addict, but there were no restrictions on our TV watching.
Oh my God. If my mother would just walk in and turn the TV off.
Wow.
Yeah, my mom kept a black and white TV in the trunk of her car, so she took care of it that way. But we don't have a TV in our house, and kids don't have access to watch whatever they want to watch. But
is
getting
healthy.
back to the content thing and going to Amazon and going to canned entertainment, there's so many great things that people just put up on their YouTube channel or whatever that are educational, that are entertaining, that you could watch. I'm not going to miss the Amazon Prime at all.
Yeah.
So you're endorsing Google, which owns YouTube. Interesting.
You can't get away. You can't get away from it.
Well, they do make you complicit in practically everything evil about corporate America. I mean, you really do have to just to work to be a vegan. You have to work at buying something that doesn't destroy the planet. even when
Yeah.
you're being a vegan.
Yeah, it takes work, and it takes, I guess enough people eventually doing it till it gets to a tipping point where then that becomes the norm. And that's hard to do, especially when you think you're alone.
It's hard to do when you're hogtied, but you can do little bits here and there. Look at all the people baking bread now. If I hear someone talk about their sourdough one more time,
Yeah. Well, I'm more of a banana bread guy, and so I've been doing that.
Yeah, so I needed to buy some flour, and again, I found a small mill in Utah.
Yeah.
That's just fantastic flour. I'd never heard of it. Came by mail to my house, but I bought 100 pounds, so we can't really complain about the packaging. And it was all paper, packaged in paper. It's just like a fantastic product. Probably could have bought it on Amazon and stiffed the company for some money. Why would you want to do that?
Right.
What about getting
Because I'm still saving a lot of money compared to buying bread.
Do you have a coffee grinder?
Yeah.
Buy 100 pounds of wheat berry and make your own flour with a coffee grinder.
Boy, we eat a lot of bread, David. That coffee grinder, I'm afraid, would burn out in short order.
Have you tried milling your own wheat berry?
I have not, but I'm sure we could buy a machine to do that, which would kind of, environmentally speaking, be against the point of pooling resources and efficiently running through a machine in Utah.
What about a hand cranked? What about a hand cranked mill? I'm being serious.
Yeah, you could do it, but still, if you think about it, let's get 100, 50 million households to buy a hand crank mill. I mean, yeah, that's how we built America, but it's not going to have a great footprint. I'd rather just use a mill where they know what they're doing and they can buy organic wheat berries from a whole bunch of small farmers.
Well, you have to understand, David churned his own butter. So
only on the dance floor. I do the butter churn on the dance floor.
Yes.
Now, if you mill your own lumber, David, now there I'll really be impressed.
Yeah. So, Tarek, we've got to close now, but why don't you take just a minute here to kind of sum up your how to avoid Amazon tips or philosophy?
Okay, so when you do searches, get rid of Amazon, do -amazon.com, and you're stuck with the ads, but it'll free up a little space. As David said, make sure you really need that thing you like to buy. And yeah, let's have a little fun. Let's load up some Amazon carts and then get satisfaction by deleting all the items. Learn about businesses that specialize in what they do and give them your business. And don't forget mom and pop, they're still there. They often have things in stock. And the more you buy from them, the more they'll have in stock. So I think that sort of sums it up for me.
Well, there you have it, people. You've got it right there. Thank you very much, Tarek, for joining us. And we hope maybe we'll have you back.
Well, thanks, Steve. Thanks, David.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
We've been speaking with Tarek Milleron. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to answer some of your listener questions. Listener John Nash says, and he's referring to the episode we did a couple weeks ago with Barbara Fries, when Barbara Fries and Ralph, you talked about auto safety and the history of corporate denial there. And he says, how can you talk about the history of seatbelts in the U.S. without mentioning John Paul Stapp, who did the rocket sled testing? He tried to convince the government and the car manufacturers to put seatbelts in cars without success.
Well, I think he did have success because he put his own safety on the line with these speed sleds at Wright Air Force Base, which stopped suddenly to show that seatbelts could restrain an occupant in the car without damaging internal organs, which the auto companies were talking about. It's going to rip out your kidney or your liver, etc. I can't count the number of times I pay tribute to John Paul Stapp and his conferences that I attended as a young lawyer and learned so much from. He is a real hero, a medical doctor and a colonel in the Air Force. But you can't mention all the people who were heroes in this movement, and a very tiny reference to seatbelts when you're talking about face masks and the resistance to face masks.
Right. And Ralph, who was the pilot who pioneered a lot of the safety technology? And as I recall in my research for An Unreasonable Man, he, and reading Unsafe at Any Speed, he was the one who had a plane crash or was in a plane crash. He survived, and he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out why did he survive and nobody else did. And it was the idea of the second collision.
I think you're talking about Hugh DeHaven.
Right.
Yes, and he then started wondering how people who fell 4 stories survived at the bottom of the ground. And
right.
So he began to see that different G-forces, if they're distributed, can allow people to live. But if they are concentrated, the way, say, a pin is, the human physiology has less of a chance to survive. And that's where the concept of padded dash panels and other safety devices came into recognition. So he was really one of the great pioneers as well, Hugh DeHaven.
Hugh DeHaven, yes. And just to clarify for people, the second collision, obviously the first collision is the car with another car or a barrier of some kind. And the second collision is the human being inside the car. And that was really the insight.
That's right. The human beings smashing against the windshield or the metallic dash panel or the steering column. Yeah, that's the second collision. If you can interfere between the first collision and the second by airbags, padded dash panels, seat belts, you will save the occupants.
Right. Well, thank you for that question, John. I want to thank our guests again, Dr. Bandy Lee and Jeff Bezos' worst nemesis, Tarek Milliron. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up. A transcript of the show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Ralph's got a couple of new books. The Fable, How the Rats Reformed the Congress. To acquire a copy of that, go to ratsreformcongress.org. And Fake President, Decoding Trump's Gaslighting, Corruption, and General BS, co-written with Mark Green. We will link to that also. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Get active.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up. First, Steve asks a question of Dr. Bandy Lee.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. That was, again, fascinating. And I just have to say, when you were describing Trump's poll numbers correlating with his exposure to the world, I couldn't help thinking that it was like he was an airborne virus.
Yes. Well, I've been calling it Trump's mental health pandemic, so we're very much in line.
Can I ask you one more question before we go?
Yes.
This is a hypothetical. If Donald Trump is not reelected and say he went to prison for many reasons, and he was part of his rehabilitation was to go see you and go to therapy, is there any way you think you could get through to him, or is he just too old and too set in his ways and too well defended to make any kind of progress in changing his mental outlook?
Right. He's not of the kind of mental debility that renders itself well to treatment, but I specialize in treating such individuals, and so I develop techniques and such where I believe that everybody can be helped in some way. But for someone like him, removal from his ability to cause harm, that is incarceration or hospitalization, that alone is treatment. And not allowing him to swell in his delusions of grandeur and delusions of omnipotence and omniscience, that alone is treatment. So all of those things are treatment, and I would add to that.
And we conclude with David and Steve's extended freeform conversation with Tarek Milliron.
I'm just curious about the family tree. My daughter studied with Laura Nader at Berkeley.
Yeah, I know.
Is that your mom?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my mom.
Oh,
yeah.
my daughter. Oh my God. My daughter. I mean, that was the class that she talked about.
Big
Yeah,
fan.
my mom
Big
just
fan.
retired after 60 years at Cal. So
That's amazing.
you can
Her and
tell.
David, her office, because I went there to interview when I did the movie, was right down the hallway from Angela Davis. So
Wow.
how about that floor?
Yeah. So I'll just share this with you. She was studying with your mom before I knew Ralph, before we had the radio show. So, like, I would ask about, her classes and the systems of control. And when I got a radio, when Ralph,
You're going to tell this story?
the radio show, I have to admit, she pretended to be like angry that I was one-upping her with the Naders, the connection to the Naders. It was like, I don't need to hear your stories anymore about your class with Professor Nader. But she did tell you, she was in a car accident and she was wearing her seatbelt and the airbags went off. And she said, this was 3 years ago. And the first thing she thought, I'm getting the chills telling you this. I don't know why. It must be the COVID. But she said the airbag went off. And the first thing she thought of was, thank God for Ralph Nader.
Wow.
It was the first, like the accident, boom, airbag goes off. And she called me and she said, the first thing I thought of was, thank God for Ralph Nader. Well, anyway.
Wow. Yeah, I in terms of I don't mind that we're being recorded, but when I was a kid, I was a big baseball fan just because my Uncle Ralph was a big baseball fan. And I lived in Berkeley, but I was a Yankees fan, which was because he was a Yankees fan. And, it was anathema to my classmates who are all Oakland A's fans or San Francisco Giants fans, but mainly A's. But then when I was about 10 years old, I think I was just 10, the World Series just ended and a bunch of Yankees players were traded. And it just made
Ricky Henderson went to the Oakland A's, didn't he?
Yeah.
Or he went to the Yankees.
Reggie Jackson. In any case, I just saw this huge contradiction. It kind of blew my mind that my uncle was a fan of these organizations that traded people around, and I just abruptly stopped being a baseball fan right then and there. So
I asked him about that. I called him on that. I asked him how he could be a Yankee fan. And he said something, he grew up in Connecticut and, he listened to the Yankees. He said something about you can't shake a childhood impression. You should write a book, if I may be so bold, surviving, like having to live up, it's the pressures of living.
The funny thing is, I'll tell you another story if you want to hear it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Steve may know. So during the 2000 campaign, we had quite a bit of attention, and we did Letterman and we did Jay Leno. And so we had the meeting, Letterman didn't come back to the green room. I don't think he does or did that ever, but Leno comes back and pops in and he starts doing the interview, the pre-interview. And he says, Ralph, what do you do for fun? And I just see this stricken look, right? And my uncle says, strawberries. I like to eat strawberries. Well, this is so bizarre to me. He's trying to reach for something healthy, and there is a strawberry festival where he grew up, but it was so bizarre. I kind of panicked, and I said, Jay, he was a huge baseball fan. Huge, and he has an encyclopedic knowledge of baseball.
Yeah.
And Leno looks at me like, who the hell are you? So we get on, and he goes on the show, and Leno says, I'm sitting in the audience, on the edge of my seat, and Leno says, so Ralph, what do you do for fun? Like you're such a curmudgeon, do you ever have fun kind of thing?
Yeah.
And No baseball. Strawberries
Good.
comes out
Good.
again.
Good.
But it was just reaching for something, so because he's a private person. So,
Yeah.
of course, I went up afterwards and tried to tell them they could edit that out and so on. They just looked disgustedly at me.
Yeah.
No, I think that's the proper
But he
answer.
does have fun. I watched Return of the Jedi at a drive-in in rural Ontario, Canada, with him outside the passenger seat window, so I could tell him what was going on. And he had the greatest time with Jabba the Hutt and so forth. So, sorry, David, but yeah, there were those corrupting influences that crept in.
That's
I think strawberries is the better answer than baseball.
Well, of course.
You're crazy. Strawberries is what Captain Queeg says.
I know. It's funny. I mean, it's branding, isn't it? If you're going on the Tonight Show, it's fun. People are going to remember that your answer is strawberries.
Yeah, and they're going to think I don't relate to this person.
Yeah, exactly. But I suppose it was true to himself in a way, because he was trying to parry the whole thing. Yeah, kind of like we always have this back and forth where he wants to say something's nutritious first, and I want to say it's delicious.
Yeah.
Delicious first and nutritious.
Yeah. Yeah.
He just wants to say nutritious because that's automatically delicious. But that's not really how it works.
That's not really true either.
No.
I think I would buy a book. Just growing up in the shadow of your mother and Ralph Nader. That would be so funny. That would be so funny. How do you rebel against the ultimate rebel?
I'll tell you how. You don't go to law school.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. That must have been a heartbreak.
Yeah, no, see, I had my mom to pattern off of, and I went to the end of the earth instead.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when we speak to Alternative Radio's David Barsimian about his book, Retargeting Iran, a primer on the conflict between the U.S. and Iran by various Middle East scholars. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.